think for me, transgenerational trauma has to come back to the stuff that's not seen. It's the stuff that sits under the surface that waits and waits and waits, and one day explodes out of a person with seemingly no reason at all.
Trauma that comes from generation to generation, and it could be passed on or it could be experienced, which a lot of generation of Aboriginal people have done in this country in the last over 200 years or so.
I can see it in my family, from my grandfather on to my father, then down to us, and even me passing some of that stuff down to my children. But hopefully my children can work through their own stuff and haven't been damaged enough so that they've got to pass it on to their children. It can get broken somewhere.
Trauma that's been handed down from the family, racism is a really bad. To me, transgenerational trauma is racism to the max.
I believe transgenerational trauma is about trauma that is experienced from one generation to the next, yet there isn't enough time to heal during that generation. What we actually then do is we change our behaviours to adapt to our hurts and our sorrow and our anger and all those things that haven't been experienced because of what has just happened to us. We don't have time to heal from that before the next trauma comes along.
I think it's different things to different people, but the teaching is that it's, I guess, unresolved wounds, or wounds that where the hurt hasn't been resolved, simply because you don't know that you've been hurt, and so you continue on practicing the behaviours that hurt causes to the generations to come.
All the past, all the wrongs that's been put on my parents, my family, may not be personally, but my community, my mob, and I believe we carry that too, because all the injustice that has been put on them, and we see their struggle, we still struggle that today.
There's two core things I think that really come into it. One is post-traumatic stress disorder, and one is the psychological effects of colonisation, which is really oppression in the lived experience of it.
So it's when a person who has had their personality compromised or diminished or closeted or closed and put in a closet, and it goes from generation to the next generation to the next generation.
Remembered pain and suffering of a group. I really feel with the Aboriginal mind that tribal mind of being at one with each other is still very, very much there. So the trauma surrounds the whole group, and that is why it's so hard for an individual to break free from it, because every time they return back to the brothers or the sisters, something's always happening. And they feel it so deep in their being that it triggers the trauma again, and it triggers the wound and the pain.
For me, the feeling word is painful, because that's where it goes deep to soul, and that's where a lot of the pain comes from, and that's where it's carried in our soul. It's like there's layers on us, and it's the hurt and the pain that we react to or work from, or live from, because we feel deeply. I just think as a culture we are connected a lot more to who we are, our feelings, our environment.
Transgenerational trauma, begins from the beginning, like I said, from the imposition, where our forefathers were racially profiled. In my generation we were racially profiled, and in my children's generation they have been subject to racial profiling by the authorities that have been imposed on us.
Well, education, land, and things like the loss of land was a big part. I believe, connection. We're all scattered all over. We don't have that close bond connection like we used to. And I believe, the link is missing to each other.
When you're sitting down and you want to sit down and pour your heart and soul out to dig through all of this stuff that you've carried with you from your mother, who's carried it from her mother, who's carried it from her mother, where do you begin? And only being an Aboriginal person, whether you're a man or a woman, can you begin to understand what that stuff is. It's in your DNA almost. It's the things you don't even think about. It's trying to find an understanding inside of you while you wake up every day. In the life that you like, you're not happy. Understanding, where does this come from? How did I inherit this? How can I take this out of my makeup and be who I am today?
So if a whole collection of people go through a very traumatic experience, which is what happened way back when, at first colonization, I'll get back to that. Essentially the whole community, the whole nation, the whole of the people will end up living in that kind of fear-based fight or flight mechanisms. Can't trust anyone, don't know what's happening next, constantly on alert. And so essentially aren't able to actually just live and breathe and be. And then ultimately end up raising their children in a similar way, from a similar place. People being told that they're worthless or nothing or wrong or even evil often enough end up to some extent swallowing that poison down and believing it and telling themselves that.
Quite often a lot of the people who were stolen are my age now. So they're probably into recognising the things that that they've seen and done and heard and practiced haven't been so good. So meantime they probably have 5 generations after them. So that's a lot of hurt to heal within the community.
I think through trauma, the ability to love and to love yourself becomes quite difficult.
Because of the pain and the experience, it fractures us, our soul, our who we are as a person, families, and the fractures grow deeper without the healing.
What happens is that we are constantly alert, we're constantly hypervigilant, all those sorts of things happen. And from being in that state of heightened awareness, actually then begins to affect ourselves, not only physically, it affects us mentally and spiritually.
It gets passed on to the children. Now it gets passed on through the blood, but it also gets passed on just by what they see and the energy field that's created, because everyone has their own little aura energy field and a pain body, and then there's a group pain body and a tribal pain body, and they all feel it. And so you walk into the home and there is that energy field of trauma there, and they come in. Even sometimes they have a visitor. That's the other thing. Another visitor will come in with a trauma, and it just starts to trigger all the trauma.
And what's happened to us during this 200 years, over 200 years, can be added up to crimes against humanity. First imposition was massacration, which historians try to delete in the history of this country in the last 200 years. So you can just imagine the trauma of the survivors of the massacration, and their descendants after that, because this imposition is still here.
What we see on the outside is crime and poverty and abuse and domestic violence and substance, drugs and alcohol abuse. They're kind of like the symptoms, but they're the things that people look at and go, what are you doing? And then, irony of ironies, judge the Aboriginal people for engaging in those kind of behaviours, thereby affirming the very patterns of self-belief and worthlessness that are at the cause of it in the first place. So it keeps it actually in place, which is tragic, if not worse.
You know, I see it because I work in the hospital. So what I see is a lot of people self-medicating because of that deep-seated pain that they can't even name or vocalise, or they just experience it in what they do. And even not even about self-medicating, about not making decisions around their health, you know. I've seen people not control their diabetes, which leads to they're losing bits of their body, you know, you know, I've seen people die because of that, what they call non-compliance. That word in the hospital drives me crazy. That's the language that the non-Aboriginal people use around people who don't behave themselves and do what they want them to do. It's that non-compliant, you know, and people have chosen that path and got down there with their drug use and with their not looking after them and understanding how to keep going, because they don't know how to keep going. And while they know they're going towards destruction, it's like they can't see the end to it.
Re-traumatising yourself, like putting yourself in unsafe situations, sexual assault, domestic violence, even work trauma. You know, being in a workplace where you're not supported, where you have somebody that's micromanaging you, that can really traumatise you.
Transgenerational trauma also looks like lateral violence. It looks like loss of self-esteem, loss of what we would consider our basic rights. So what we also do as an effect of transgenerational trauma is we start hitting out at others around us. They'll be our brothers, our sisters, our other community organisations, but within our communities, as an oppressed community, we will always try to find somebody that we can oppress at times, and that's one of the results of transgenerational trauma. I think it's one of the biggest that we need to deal with on a daily basis.
Alcoholism, addictions to substances, but also addictions to people and types of people as well. So therefore, things like when you're in a family situation where you encounter domestic violence of any nature, whether it be physical or verbal, then some of that stuff doesn't rise its head until you're in a relationship which offers you the leeway to also, you know, act those things out.
I think if you look around, you know, especially in Indigenous communities where there's quite a lot of people living, or, you know, a mission setting, you can see trauma from the time you walk into that community to the time you walk out, walking all around you. And more often than not, it's looking at faces and hurt within those faces and sadness.
We go to funerals to mourn that person, their life and everything, but we seem to be always going, that's the only time we connect with our mob, is at something sad like that. So we're dealing with the sadness of one funeral, and then, you know, a couple of weeks later we go back and we deal with another family member we lost. So we're never getting that chance to be on top as an individual. We're always getting mourning and mourning, and then we have to go on with life and everything, and yet we're still carrying the grief, and it just eats away, you know. And then we come up, you know, 12 months down the track, one of the boys or one of the sisters, are, you know, have a mental health issue, but they don't want to deal with that. But they don't realise it's all the grief that they're really suffering. And it's not just, we want to deal with it as a person, but the systems don't want to deal with it. They want to put us into a medical thing. And they don't realise it's our heart, our soul, it's our whole way of life that is breaking down around us.
But really, Aboriginal people are that traumatised What I see and what I notice is that it's so over-traumatised that everything's just natural now. We just think everything's natural. But deep down, you know, there's trauma still happening.
They are so traumatised that they have to sink themselves into ways of stopping the hurt, I guess, drinking. In the early days, not so much drugging, but certainly drinking. And so their role modelling is very poor to their families, and it's really hard it's not really hard, they just can't teach to resolve your issues without aggression and without something to make you brave, like alcohol, or to just try and forget it, drown in it.
I've been out of school 20 odd years. My kids are still copying what I copped at school. So, I mean, I don't think it's changed at all. I think it's actually gotten worse. I mean, I had to physically fight for an education. And I think my kids don't have to physically fight, but they have to fight to have it. And it's not just the kids they're fighting against, it's the bureaucrats in the schools.
One of our senior people has got beautiful, beautiful Guru students who happen to be Guru, living in this community, been here for countless generations, not coming to school. So I went to this beautiful grandmother and I said, "Oh, your grandchildren are not coming to school." We talked for a little while. After a short while, with a tear in grandmother's eyes, she said, "You're still taking my children away." I don't know what you mean. What are you saying, Nan? Oh, 30 years ago, only 30 years ago, you were taking my children. You were stealing my children away. Now you come to me in 2012 and you're telling me it's law that I have to give my children to you? How's that not stealing? This is through the tears in her eyes. How is this not stealing, she said. Then I responded in saying, but this is a culturally safe place for your children to be. It's an empowering place for your children to be. And she said, well, if it is, why are you continually suspending my children and telling my children they have no place in your school? There's no pride of place there. You're asking me to send my grandchildren to this system that makes shame and blame their middle name. And you're asking me, as a grandparent, as a parent, to send my most prized possession to this system that's foreign, that's alien, doesn't have any Indigenous languages, doesn't have a lot of Indigenous content. It's all about Indonesian languages. It's all about the geography of the world, but nothing about the Gabal nation, our philosophies, our worldviews, that which has maintained the delicate ecosystem since the dawn of time. Nobody's come to me, says Nan to the teacher. So yes, intergenerational trauma is real. It's real and it's going on.
When there is traditional ways offered, we are not really open to it. And I think the reason why that is because of not just being institutionalised by governments, but also by religious bodies as well. And so when we're offered a healing modality that talks to our spirit as Aboriginal people, which comes from our land to help us, we tend to shy away from it.
If you are unloved and you've never been cherished or nurtured, it's pretty hard to do that with your own children because you don't know how to do it. And so your practices and your choices may not be the best ones for you to be able to to pass on those good practices and choices, or the ability to practice, make good choices to your children, who then can't do it to their own. So down the track, people probably do have a chance to improve or to go somewhere where they can be helped to make those good choices. But quite often it's a couple of generations before that happens.
I think even with working through trauma, especially with a lot of Indigenous people, there's a fear of failure and there's a fear of success because we don't know what the success is, and we know what failure is, and we can deal with that. But it hurts. It hurts again because we see ourselves as no good. And I think sadly, with the whole of this country, a trauma that's been occurring for a lot of our people is a mindset. It's a psychological thing that I think is an inbuilt thing in a lot of Aboriginal people that think we're not good enough. Not good enough, to compete, to compare with the more dominant culture. And it's something that we really need to shift within ourselves, but we've got to help shift it within others, to start seeing ourselves as worthwhile people, instead of downclass and, violent and no good and brainless and all that sort of stuff, because they're all different little labels that we can take on board through trauma.
The reasons why people have drug addictions and alcohol issues is because they're traumatised and they don't know what to do with it. And a lot of the time it's guilt and shame, and it's when that shame overtakes you and you can't share your story with anybody because it becomes a secret that you've internalised.
We don't have time to heal ourselves physically because we can't go to hospital to get ourselves fixed because we know something else is going to happen any minute now. We don't have time to be in hospital. We don't look after our health.
So the manifestations of this sense of not knowing who you are, being worthless, being inferior, etc., if they're the things that you believe about yourself, you're being forced to believe about yourself that have passed down through the generations, then what's the point? Then what's the point of trying to make life work when all you've ever known and seen is that? And it becomes inadvertently a culture in its own right, even though that's not who these people are, let alone the culture that they actually have had forever and where they come from. It becomes a culture.
I'm a little bamboo shoot growing from the ground. If you nest and nurture and guide me, I will grow strong, tall, straight, and I will fill my capacity. If you continue to tell me that I'm not good enough to be a bamboo shoot, then I will not grow to my full capacity. If you then continue to tell me that I am not good enough to pass the exams that people have set me, who's got no relationship to me or my family, and you tell me I'm stupid, shame on you. It's the system. I left this system in 1974 as a Year 12 student. I came back here 4 years ago. Nothing's changed.
Even within the Aboriginal healing centres or Aboriginal health that I've seen throughout several cities in Australia, I'd say a safe guess of, say, 55 to 60% of the practitioners are not Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. This alarms me because how can these people understand or have even an idea of the internal makeup of a person that within their own country is a third-rate citizen, who is a person that in some states doesn't have any rights.
I think the most difficult thing for a fair-skinned Aboriginal person like myself is non-acceptance and the constantly questioning about, are you really, or how to become black? Oh, you are black. How far back? Must be an eighth black. And then there's also two, so I can be too white to be black sometimes, and too black to be white. And I find that a lot in my job, where I look white, so there's an expected norm of behaviour of a white person. Instead, it's a contradictory, because then they look at me because I say something completely different and I behave differently, and I think that makes me more of a target, more, she's just outrageous, or she's, emotional, or she's not behaving beautifully or whatever. So it's really hard for fair-skinned Aboriginal people to, it adds to the trauma because they're not accepted.
Our true remedy for this is to come back to our spirit. What does our spirit require for us to grow and be healthy again?
One of the biggest things I've learned in doing workshops and groups for healing with Aboriginal people is the absolute importance of doing it together. There's only so much healing and working through things you can do on your own, because it's the very connection of culture and community and doing it together that facilitates that healing.
It's time to work in our time with us and how we experience life and grow, and how our worldview of everything.
To begin a healing process within families, it needs to start with the parents. Parents do not give birth. I don't believe any parent gives birth to a child wanting and knowing that they're going to give it a hard time, or it's going to have a hard life. So if we can work with our parents, their best incentive to change their lives is to be a better parent for their children and to give the children the lives that they need. So again, I would say work with the individuals, find out what they need, and that's how healing will occur.
Some people just need to know that there are other ways that they can do things besides what they're doing now, to be able to heal.
Give them a true education of the history of Australia, not their education history. And, all the bureaucrats that want to have consult the community, listen with your ears and not your eyes.
In general terms, you cannot heal unless you've grieved what's been lost first. And in my view, that is one of the main obstacles, towards healing for Aboriginal people, because it's never been safe enough to grieve. People don't know how to grieve.
The trauma is a wound that needs healing, and it will keep on getting triggered until that wound is healed, because that's what we're here on earth for, is to heal that wound. And those triggers are just going to keep on coming one way or another until the core of the wound is touched and released. By ceremony, I feel. By ceremony. Grieving. Emotional ceremony.
We have within our communities wonderful, wonderful healers. They're people who heal from the spirit. We have people who heal from the mind.
I'd want to see the community empower itself, to stand on its own 2 feet. I really believe that having a school, having their own school, owning their own stuff, and not having the people that come in and ride their backs, because that just traumatises them even more.
I do believe reconnecting us back to our stories, our way of knowing, our connectedness and how we see things in the world to be validated and I think validated by a lot of people who've been fractionalised or taken away from that, to be brought back to that, to be connected with you, the land, and your fellow mob is, and you're doing that through ceremony, is amazing. I've been lucky enough to experience that, which is, for me, was very empowering to be connected, because you have your women's ceremonies, you have your men's ceremonies. So you understand, and I can speak from women, and they also have community ones, but from the women, to experience the women's ceremony, to embrace what it is to be an Aboriginal woman and connected to land, and have that connection, sitting in the dirt, like the red dirt, sitting in that red dirt and being connected to yourself as a woman, and then coming back and knowing, being strong, and then be able to relate to other people. And I can just imagine me just as empowering for men, and coming back as a community, because I know whenever I get around a lot of my mob and there's a whole group of us there, in that sort of ceremony, there's a connection, energy that happens there.
I currently run circles, and we talk about what happens in women's lives and how they might want to, if they want to change, how they might do that. And it's so easy to say, oh, I'd like to change X, but when it comes to changing X, that's not easy to do because you've lived that way all your life. So it's a slow change with lots of setbacks on the way, and you've got to be strong enough to be able to, or have the strong support to be able to get over those setbacks and say, oh well, you know, that was one thing, I'm moving on, I'm trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, I think with trauma itself, it's something that can keep reinfecting families over and over and over if there's not some formal intervention to help individuals change, because individuals can change themselves, but they can have an impact on changing others and bring about change in their whole family and making a difference. So, you know, if you look at what you grew up in, do you really want other children to grow up in that? Do you want those children to grow up and live with that same hurt, that same pain that you have? Or do you want them to grow up with something different? And I think slowly and steadily we're making inroads into that and changing the mindset. But it's a slow process, but hopefully for younger people coming through that don't have the depth of trauma that some of the older ones do, we'll see more changes come.
Knowledge, volition, action. Do you really know in the deepest recesses of your heart, your mind, your spirit and your soul that you can be the change for bigger, brighter generations? Do we really know that? If we don't really know that, then we will continue to bounce the next generation like a basketball below our knees. We will continue to domesticate them behind a desk, chain them to a chair, and make them feel a bit silly if they're not conforming to the status quo. We bounce people below our knees. Or do we really know that we have the capacity, the propensity, the resources, the positioning to work with the hearts and minds of other people's most prized possession in the most formative years of their lives to make sure they actually go and grow bigger than me. Bigger than me. And as I see them grow bigger than me, I will look, I will listen, and I will learn about how to make sure I go with them, that I'm not left behind. So that's my knowledge. If you know that, do you have the volition? Do you have the want, the wish, and the will to make yourself the agent for change? If you have the knowledge but not the will, you'll sit there like a vassal of so much knowledge and doing nothing about it. Knowledge, volition, action. What am I going to do about it? Am I going to be the little stick in the river of life that's just tossed and turned and just go, ooh? Or am I going to grow into the rudder that helps to guide and direct the river of life and says, I think we need some systemic change?
So for me, transgenerational trauma is not just reversible, we can eradicate it. We can cut it out of our way of being because it's learnt behaviour. It's not something that we chose to learn, it's something that we were brainwashed into being. We are a strong race of people. We are passive, but mostly we are loving. And so we will continue to grow and learn because we want more. Not for ourselves initially, but for our kids, our grandkids. And that's how the change will come about. Just that little pocket inside of ourselves where we sit and we say, is this it? Is this as good as it gets? And my hope for everybody is that they say no. No, this is not it. This is the beginning of the end of the old and the beginning of the new.
Happiness is the key, undoing the trauma and the hurt and the pain and the misery, because that's all you live with is misery when you're living in trauma. It's not just misery for you, it's misery for everybody involved. And it's sad to go home to a house where you can feel the tension in the air before you even get there, and then to walk into that and live in it. It's hard for children to shine in amongst that. They can't shine. It's like a dullness is over that. It's like something with, like a diamond with a wax over the top of it so that you can't see the glow. But if you take the wax off of that diamond, it glows. And I think if we take trauma out of kids' lives, that's what we're given the opportunity, is the opportunity to glow. I'm not sure what's going to happen.
If they can ever give us a chance to stop being an authority with us and let us take our time, how long it takes to resolve, let us do it. No time limit, let us resolve the issue and let us get us out of the predicament we're in.
Yeah, let us have a chance at it. Stop telling us what to do is the thing. All the policies, all the things, it's all theirs. Yeah, they talk to people, but are they really talking to people? Or are they just going in with what their agenda is?
The other thing is that not many of us sit still. Not many of us can do that. We don't think we should. And I think that's really sad, because traditionally we were able to sit still and not think about too much. I think sometimes we overthink things too. But traditionally I think we were able to sit still. We learnt that from the time we were children, even if it's sitting and waiting for a lizard or a goanna or some food to appear. You're just sitting there and you're waiting. You mightn't be doing too much.
Every person who needs to begin this process will have different needs to the next person. Communities as a whole will have different needs as well. It's about consultation, it's about finding out what's needed. I cannot stress that enough.
If it's all intergenerational, if there's a flow, then I believe and feel there's a two-way flow. One, from the parent, from the teacher to the child, to the student, that says, this didn't really empower me as a kid. What can I do to make sure that you, in 2012, as a 14-year-old, can feel large and in charge in this millennium, in this year, not past millenniums, not past years, but this year. The two-way street is the teacher, the best teachers, the best parents are the ones who are big enough and open enough to learn from the next generation. So it's like the trout swimming against the tide. To say, hey teacher, in 2012, there's a better way of teaching this with the world of IT. There's a better way of us understanding this. Are you open enough as a teacher for the student to teach you? Hey parent, yes, you have a lot of wisdom in your ways, but are you big enough and open enough for me as your 14-year-old child to tell you that there's maybe a different way of doing it. So, trans-intergenerational trauma, for me, can be flipped around, turned around to be something so positive and so powerful. It not only lifts our next generation, it continues to make sure that us as the previous generation continues to grow and expand.
People need a really strong sense of who they are and where they belong to actually have the strength, socially in the community, to be able to break through that. Not break away, break through that. And say, I'm an Aboriginal person, I know who I am, I know where I came from, and I live in a world where I am going to be brave enough to adjust enough to make life work for me and my children and their children. And to have that permission, if not from everyone in community, from a few core people who are meaningful to them, so that they can and don't have to be ashamed all over again for betraying the culture that was so betrayed by white people 200 years ago.
They have to, believe in their rights and be responsible as well. And, that's a great way to deal with trauma, is that you have a right to sit in that trauma. Like, you can sit in the pain, and once you get past that pain, then it starts to feel better and better. It can be a slow process. It can be all your life. But it's how you deal with it too. Because at the end of the day, it's yours and you own it. But there are people out there that can help.
The emotions have got to get out. No healing is going to happen until the stories are told and the emotion is felt. And that means, grieving circles with the fire, which transmutes and carries it away, must have singing, must have dances, and must have the reconnection to the ancestral energy, the ancient ancestral energy.
You can mess with my DNA, but you cannot mess with my heart. My heart walks black.
Personally recognise that changes need to occur and healing needs to begin. To embark on any healing journey, there must first be the recognition that healing needs to occur. Sometimes you just decide enough is enough, or sometimes something happens which forces you to make changes in your life. However your decision to make changes occurs, it is still an important step in your life's journey. Seek assistance from an appropriate support agency. Find a community or government organisation that can help and support you, one that will listen to your needs and has the resources to assist you. Be clear about what you need to embark on your own personal healing journey. Being clear about what you need can be a daunting task. It's not often in our lives that we feel empowered enough to ask specifically what we need. Sometimes it can take a bit more time to even work out what you actually want. Make a commitment to make changes in your life. Each person needs to make a commitment to heal their own trauma and to improve their own well-being for themselves and their community. No one else can do this for you. Even if you're being forced to make changes because of your situation, if you are not committed to the changes, they will only be temporary. Recognise your achievements. Acknowledge each time you achieve a positive result. You have worked hard through this and need to recognise that each small achievement has the potential to make huge changes in your life for you and your family. The targeted individual or group needs to recognise that changes need to occur and a healing process needs to begin. To embark on any healing journey, the group must first recognise that a healing process needs to occur. Collectively, the group needs to make a commitment to heal their trauma both individually and as a group, thus improving the overall well-being of themselves and their communities. Ask what the individual or group needs to enable them to embark on their healing journey. Consult with the individual or group to ensure that the service you are able to offer is what they actually need. Listen to what is being said. The success of your intervention will rely on the fact that you have respectfully listened to what is being said by the client. Respect that each individual or group has their own journey and their own way of getting there. Understand that the original goals set for the individual or group may change as they embark on the healing journey. Ensure that your service is flexible enough to work within these parameters.